She applied for a job as a nanny. She left as the second in command of the most dangerous crime syndicate in the country. Cassia was candidate number 734. She survived 72 hours of psychological torture, polygraph interrogation designed to break spies, and physical trials that made trained soldiers quit. She passed everything and scored higher than the Mafia boss's own head of security. On her first day, she found blood on the boss's daughter's favorite toy. She didn't flinch. She cleaned it off and handed it back like nothing happened. Within weeks, she discovered hidden surveillance devices the boss didn't know existed. She identified traitors in his organization while braiding a 4-year-old's hair. She dismantled enemy networks between bedtime stories. And when Orion, the most feared man in the city, finally understood what she truly was, he didn't fire her. He made her his queen. This is the story of how one woman walked into a fortress built on blood and fear and conquered it from within. This story will show you that real power doesn't come from muscles or weapons. It comes from being so indispensable, so dangerously competent, that even the most powerful man alive has no choice but to share his throne. If stories about fierce women, dangerous games, and rising from nothing to everything speak to you, hit that subscribe button and join this community. Drop a comment below. Have you ever been underestimated because of how you looked? And if someone you know needs to hear this message of power and transformation, share this story with them. Your support means everything. Now let me take you inside that fortress where it all began. Orion did not hire people. He acquired strategic assets. Cassia, designated as candidate 734, was a complete anomaly that defied all his categories. Her background file was pristine, far too clean, which was a clear sign it had been expertly fabricated. She had survived his entire process. 3 full days of relentless psychological screening, followed by 22 hours of polygraph interrogation that focused entirely on loyalty and ultimate intent. She endured 4 separate and grueling physical aptitude examinations, all carefully disguised as routine stress assessments. She passed every single one, scoring significantly higher than his own head of security on the stress management protocols. Now, she stood across the enormous black glass desk in his penthouse office, appearing perfectly composed. She was dressed in a tailored suit that cost less than the timepiece on Orion's wrist, yet somehow she wore it with more authority. She was unnervingly calm. Too calm for this room. Orion leaned forward in his heavy leather chair. The sound it made was deliberate, a subtle, calculated warning in the dead silence of the heavily protected space. "They informed me you handled the stress evaluation quite well," Orion stated. His voice was a low, polished gravel, specifically designed to scrape against a person's nerves. "I manage stress effectively." "Stress in this organization is not a university exercise, Cassia. It is the very foundation of this building." He made a vague gesture toward the skyline, visible through the reinforced viewport. Miles below them, the city was just a grid of cold, indifferent lights. High above them, there was nothing but the sterile silence of high-level surveillance and his absolute control. He had witnessed hundreds of people shatter in this very room. Fear typically showed itself as a sheen of sweat, hands that trembled, or a sudden desperate compulsion to talk too much. Cassia simply stood there and waited. "We discovered a significant anomaly in your history," Orion pressed, enjoying the calculated application of power. "A 4-year gap, with heavily redacted government files." "That was a personal sabbatical," she replied, her voice completely flat, utterly unbothered by the implication of espionage that was buried deep within her past. He let out a laugh. The sound was sharp, abrupt, and completely devoid of humor. "Sabbatical. The people who work for me do not get to take sabbaticals. They tend to disappear, sometimes permanently." He reached over and picked up a small, brightly colored plastic dinosaur. It was his daughter's favorite toy, forgotten during a rare visit to this side of the grand estate. A faint, dark smear was visible on its snout. It was blood. Not a large amount, just a subtle trace of oxidized crimson, just enough to catch the overhead light. Cassia's eyes followed the movement of the small toy. There was no flinch, no sign of moral judgment, just cold, detached observation. "You understand the rules of engagement here," Orion stated, dropping the dinosaur back onto the pristine glass surface. "This is not a job. It is a total exposure. You will see things, things you can never unsee. My life is inherently dangerous. By simple proximity, your life is now lethal." He paused, waiting for the expected sign of retreat, the flicker of raw panic, the sudden, delayed realization that the astronomical salary was not worth the sheer physical risk of breathing the same air as him. Cassia did not move a single inch. Instead, she moved toward the desk. She stepped smoothly around the corner, her movements fluid and strikingly efficient. She was not approaching her new boss. She was approaching the evidence. She carefully picked up the plastic dinosaur. Her long, slender fingers wiped the thin smear of blood away with professional swiftness. Using a tissue she had pulled from an inner pocket of her jacket, she held the newly cleaned toy with immense care. Only then did she look up to meet Orion's gaze. Her eyes were a deep, steady gray, completely devoid of the panic or the perverse curiosity he usually saw in people. "They warned me your world was too large," she whispered, the sound barely carrying across the vast room. "Too bloody, too tightly controlled for any outsider." She placed the dinosaur back exactly where it had been, now slightly cleaner, slightly safer. "I am capable of handling all of it." Orion remained still for a long count. He was a predator who had just been expertly assessed by something equally sharp and dangerous. He had laid out all the danger, the rules, the implicit and explicit threats. He had fully expected her submission. What he got was quiet competence. He hired her right there on the spot. He absolutely needed to know what she was. Cassia transitioned into the demanding role seamlessly, almost too seamlessly. The entire compound was a modern fortress cleverly disguised as a luxury estate. It had concrete walls thicker than the vaults of most banks. Biometric scanners were on every single door. Armed patrols made their rounds every hour. Yet Cassia moved through it all as if she owned the place, navigating the complex internal politics of the staff, the cooks, the drivers, and the personal security detail with an unspoken, quiet authority. She never tried to gain favor. She simply demanded respect through her sheer, unwavering professional neutrality. Orion watched her constantly. He monitored his integrated surveillance system more closely than he monitored the stock market. His daughter, Ara, was the true measure of all things in his world. Ara had successfully fired the last 4 nannies, either through explosive tantrums or her sheer, stubborn refusal to form any bond. But Ara had accepted Cassia on the very first day. He watched Cassia sitting in the sunroom, reading a story to Ara. The afternoon light caught the sharp angle of her jaw. She was focused, completely attentive, but always maintained a periphery awareness that deeply unnerved him. Every sound from outside the protected room registered with her, though her voice never broke its steady rhythm. One afternoon, Orion entered the room unannounced. He wanted to catch her off her guard, to find that one moment when her professional mask slipped. Instead, he found Cassia supervising Ara's puzzle time. "The security report for the West Wing was compromised this morning," Orion stated flatly, his eyes fixed on her hands. Cassia did not even look up from helping Ara locate a missing piece that was shaped like a castle turret. "That wing faces the public road. It was always going to be the weakest point in your security." Her response was dry, factual, with no feigned concern for his corporate problems. There was no clumsy attempt at flattery. "And you would know this how?" "I read the architectural blueprints before I signed the non-disclosure agreement," she replied simply. "A good nanny always knows the escape routes before the child does." Orion felt a distinct coldness settle deep in his gut. This was far beyond professional dedication. This was tactical intelligence. He then noticed a small wooden toy car that Ara cherished. It looked unusually heavy, dense for a toy. He reached for it, casually inspecting its base. Ara loves this one, he murmured. She does, Cassia agreed, her tone still perfectly mild. But it vibrates sometimes. We probably need to check the battery. Orion's fingers located a tiny, almost invisible seam on the underside of the car's chassis. It was not a battery compartment. It was expertly designed to house something else entirely, something digital and very expensive. It was a specialized tracking device, high-end military grade, engineered to transmit location and audio through heavy shielding. He did not need to open it to know for certain. He looked directly at Cassia. She met his intense gaze without flinching. She did not confess. She did not accuse him. She just knew. And he knew that she knew. The unspoken subtext flowed between them, thick and completely silent. I found the bug someone planted in your daughter's toy. I know what you are really looking for. It was a gift from an old associate, Orion lied smoothly. I should have it properly disposed of. It is always best to be thorough, Cassia said, retrieving the car and carefully placing it on a high shelf well out of Ara's reach. You never truly know who is watching. After that, Orion started inviting Cassia to dinner. It was not out of affection, but to observe her under intense, prolonged scrutiny, far away from the easy, sterile answers of the security feeds. The dinners were silent, tense affairs in his private dining room, overseen by portraits of his dead syndicate ancestors. Ara was always sound asleep by then. One night, their conversation drifted to the true cost of maintaining control. People think power is about taking whatever you want, Orion mused, swirling the expensive wine in his glass. They are wrong. Real power is about keeping what you already have, and that requires constant, brutal vigilance. Cassia ate slowly, methodically. Vigilance is exhausting, she observed. Exhausting, yes, but absolutely necessary. I do not trust anyone who has not proved they can sacrifice everything for me. Sacrifice is the easy part, Cassia countered, finally looking up from her plate. The hard part is living with the results of that sacrifice. Orion paused his motion. This was not the conversation of a nanny. This was the language of the operational field. What exactly did you sacrifice, Cassia, during your so-called sabbatical? He pressed, leaning back in his chair. A slight hesitation followed, the only true crack he had ever witnessed in her perfect composure. My ability to be surprised, she finally answered. The response was devastatingly effective and utterly chilling. It implied a personal history too dark for surprise, a saturation point of trauma and violence that few could comprehend. Orion smiled, a brief flash of teeth that rarely reached his eyes. Surprise is what gets you killed here. You understand that, do you not? That is precisely why you are still breathing. The subtext was crystal clear. I know you are hiding something lethal. I am simply waiting for you to use it. The external pressure on his organization began to ramp up. The Hydra, a rival syndicate known for its surgical and targeted strikes, was getting bolder. Vague threats were transitioning from simple territory disputes to direct personal attacks. The atmosphere inside the compound became as tense as razor wire. The security details were doubled. Orion stopped sleeping for more than 4 hours a night. He found Cassia awake at 3 in the morning on one occasion, not watching television, but standing silently by Ara's crib. She was not checking on the child. She was checking the room itself. Her hand rested almost casually near a pane of reinforced window glass. Can't sleep? Orion asked, stepping out from the deep shadows of the hallway. I sleep when the threat level drops below red, she replied without turning around. Tonight it feels purple. Purple? That was a color signifying deep penetration. Not just an attack on the perimeter, but something that was already inside. Orion crossed the large room. He stood close enough to smell the faint, clean scent of her soap, close enough to feel the physical heat that radiated off her skin. The proximity was intentional. He was testing her physical reaction to his power, to his sheer presence. "You sound like you know a great deal about infiltration," he murmured. "I know how the human mind works when it is under extreme pressure. When the walls get too thick, people start looking for the thin spots." "And where is the thin spot in this fortress, Cassia?" She finally turned to face him, their faces now just inches apart. The tension between them was not romantic, but purely kinetic, like two loaded weapons pointed directly at each other. "You," she said, her voice sharp and precise. "You are the vulnerability. When you are broken, no wall can protect you." The words struck Orion with the force of a physical blow, a cold wave of understanding washing over him. She had seen right through his power to the fragile core of his position, articulating the crushing weight of his command in a way his most trusted advisors would never dare. He took a deliberate step back, re-establishing the distance between them. "That only makes your responsibility greater. You must now guard that very weakness," he commanded her. Cassia's lips barely moved as she replied, "I already told you. I can bear all of it." He turned and left her standing there, a silhouette against the heavily guarded night. Orion knew he was courting disaster, yet the intoxicating thrill of seeing her defy every known rule of fear was becoming vital to him. He was already hopelessly hooked on her refusal to submit. He immediately initiated a comprehensive investigation into her history, assigning his head of security, Marcus, to uncover the true identity of Cassia. No expense was too great, no law too sacred. He had to know the nature of the weapon he had willingly brought into his own home. This quiet, unassuming nanny was either his last hope for salvation or the most meticulously patient assassin he had ever encountered. Orion needed the truth, and he needed it immediately. The paranoia he wore as a shield had transformed into a razor-sharp blade pressed firmly against his own throat, and Cassia's hand was the only one on the hilt. The entire investigation quickly devolved into a futile search in an endless void. Marcus, a man built like a fortress with the hollow eyes of a man who has seen too much, looked completely defeated when he spoke of her. "Sir, all the surface documentation is absolutely perfect. Every background check, certification, and reference cleared without a single flag. But the moment we delve into deeper sources, her entire profile disintegrates into meaningless digital noise. She exists exactly where the paperwork says she should, and nowhere else." Orion remained seated in the darkened room, the sprawling city lights far below his penthouse suite blurring into a chaotic, formless glow. "So the files are redacted." "No, sir, not redacted. They are gone, utterly erased. It is a complete and total sweep. It is as if she simply blinked into existence 3 years ago, just in time to enroll in her first nanny training course." Marcus hesitated, shifting his considerable weight. "The only organization with that kind of power is—" "I am well aware of who has that power, Marcus. Dig deeper. Find the flaws. I do not care if you have to incinerate an entire server installation to discover one single fingerprint that contradicts her story. Find the woman behind the mask." Orion had a deep-seated distrust of anything flawless. Perfect documents were an absolute guarantee of a sophisticated lie. A real, well-constructed falsehood always had messy edges. This was surgically precise. He started monitoring her around the clock, not just through the standard video feeds, but by accessing the high-fidelity, sound-isolated streams from the compound's secure internal network. The nanny cam became his tactical command screen as he analyzed her every gesture, searching for the slightest inconsistency. The first glimpse of the truth arrived cleverly hidden inside a moment of childhood comfort. His daughter, Ara, owned a worn, beloved stuffed lion. Cassia was in Ara's room folding laundry, humming a quiet, shapeless tune. She paused to pick up the lion, gently smoothing its matted fur. Her actions were smooth and professional, the picture of domestic calm, right up until they were not. Her thumb pressed into the lion's left eye socket with focused intent. There was a pause that lasted no more than a heartbeat. Then, her fingers moved with the mechanical speed and efficiency of a trained operative. She did not tear the fabric. Instead, she located a weak point in the stitching, inserted a fingernail beneath the thread, and deftly extracted a tiny plastic disc the size of a pinhead. It was a military-grade satellite tracker, fully active and transmitting its location, concealed with expert skill. Cassia showed no surprise. The soft melody she was humming never faltered. She simply crushed the device between her thumb and forefinger, producing a faint, clean snap, then let the fragments fall into the deep pocket of her pants. She immediately went back to folding a small pink shirt. In his office, Orion leaned forward so quickly that the leather of his chair protested with a soft groan. The air emptied from his lungs in a silent rush. That action was not one of discovery or defense. It was a matter of routine. She had not been startled to find the listening device. She had simply reacted to the operational need for its immediate disposal. This meant she either knew it was there all along, or she possessed the kind of training that made her check for such things instinctively. Later that evening, he found her in the kitchen, where she always insisted on preparing simple, healthy meals herself, turning away the highly paid compound chefs. He decided it was time to make his move. "It looks like the lion has lost some of its stuffing," Orion remarked casually, leaning his weight against the cold granite of the kitchen island. Cassia did not bother to look up from the vegetables she was chopping. The knife in her hand was thin and wickedly sharp, moving with a lethal, practiced precision. "Ara can be rough with her playthings. We were able to patch him up. Did you discover anything of interest inside him?" For a fraction of a second, the knife stopped its motion, hovering a single millimeter above the wooden cutting board. It was the only visible break in her composure. "Just the usual cheap polyester fiber," she answered, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "They certainly are not made as well as they used to be." Orion held her gaze, refusing to look away. He felt that familiar surge of adrenaline, the icy excitement he typically reserved for negotiations where millions were at stake. He was in a verbal battle with a woman over a child's toy, and he was undeniably losing. Sometimes the most ordinary objects carry the most significant secrets, Cassia. A single speck of dust is enough to obscure the sharpest vision. She resumed her chopping, the rhythm returning, fast and unwavering. "Only if you allow it to," she stated. He walked out of the kitchen, but the image of her fingers effortlessly crushing the tracker was seared into his mind. In that moment, he understood that all his security evaluations had been completely useless. She had not simply passed his tests, she had likely designed them herself as a form of mockery. Meanwhile, the Hydra organization was escalating its attacks. They were using the intelligence they had patiently collected for more than a year, striking at the vulnerable points in his supply lines and targeting his secondary properties. The entire compound was on edge. The guards were jumpy, their uniforms stained dark with nervous sweat. One night, a violent noise shattered the calm. It was not a warning shot. It was the sustained, deafening roar of automatic weapon fire, erupting perhaps a half-mile beyond the perimeter. The entire staff descended into chaos as guards scrambled to their defensive positions. Orion ran for the control room with his weapon already in his hand, but he skidded to a halt just outside of Ara's bedroom. He did not go in. Instead, he fixed his eyes on the security monitor built into the corridor wall. Ara had woken up the instant the noise started, sitting bolt upright in her bed and letting out the high, terrified shriek of a child who can sense danger without understanding its source. Cassia was already at her side. She made no attempt to muffle the sound. She did not tell Ara it was only a thunderstorm or late-night fireworks. She refused to lie. "Listen closely to that, Ara." Cassia's voice was perfectly calm, low and full of authority. "That is the sound of people being extremely loud outside, almost like they are stomping their feet very hard." Ara sobbed, clutching her blanket tightly. "I am afraid. It is only noise." "Noise is only a danger if it manages to get inside, and it cannot get in. Look at this wall. Can you see it moving? Is the ceiling about to fall down?" "No." "Very good. That is because these walls are very thick. The men who are making that noise are very busy. They are focused on their job, and we will now focus on ours. Our job is to be quiet. We will remain here, and we will wait for the quiet to return. Can you feel your heart beating? Cassia took the child's small hand and gently placed it over her own heart. Mine is calm. Yours needs to slow down to match mine. Breathe with me now. Outside, the barrage of assault rifle fire grew more intense, a raging mechanical tempest, but Cassia maintained the breathing rhythm, slow and steady and deep. She had transformed a violent, horrifying experience into a simple, focused exercise in self-control. She was teaching the child not to fear the chaos, but to isolate and control her reaction to it. Orion stood frozen in the hallway. His blood felt like ice in his veins. A normal nanny would have used distraction. They would have used comforting lies. Cassia, however, was using the brutal reality of the situation as a tool, masterfully reshaping his daughter's raw terror into disciplined focus. This was not something taught in any childcare course. This was operational stress inoculation. The second report from Marcus arrived 3 days later. His words were clipped and grim. Sir, the files we managed to access were decoys. We traced the server's origin point to a decommissioned intelligence black site in Eastern Europe. That facility was officially abandoned 7 years ago. The files themselves were uploaded just 6 months ago. It is a digital dead end, constructed to create the illusion of a normal life. What does that mean? It means, sir, that someone is actively covering tracks that were already professionally erased. Whoever is behind this has incredible resources, far beyond just money. This is the work of government-level experts who specialize in making people disappear. Marcus swallowed, his difficulty clear. We have run her image through every known international database for black operations. There is no match. She is a complete blank slate, sir, and that is quite possibly the most dangerous thing we have ever encountered. Orion waved him away. He did not need Marcus to spell out the obvious. Cassia was a ghost, a human weapon designed for deep infiltration, and she was currently living 2 floors above him, playing with dolls and reading bedtime stories to his daughter. He had no choice but to test the blade himself. He chose his private study as the location. At midnight, he summoned her downstairs, using the excuse that he required assistance organizing confidential documents. The documents he laid out were, in fact, the entire operational blueprint of the Lyra Syndicate. They contained coded financial ledgers, detailed logistics maps for his most sensitive shipments, and the emergency contingency plans for extracting his high-level assets. He watched her hands carefully as she began to sort through the papers. Her face remained a mask of professional neutrality, but her eyes moved rapidly across the pages, absorbing the information like parched ground absorbs water. She was not just filing the documents, she was committing every detail to memory. Orion poured himself a glass of bourbon, deliberately not offering one to her. Cassia, you must understand the foundation of this household. We operate on the principle of loyalty, unbreakable loyalty. I understand perfectly, Mr. Orion. Loyalty is never free. It is paid for with time, with effort, and sometimes with the lives of those you value. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial tone. Have you ever been forced to make a clean cut? To remove a diseased part before the sickness can corrupt the rest? She neatly stacked a pile of financial records, tapping the edge against the polished wood of the desk in a steady rhythm. A clean cut always leaves a scar, she said without looking up, but it ensures the rest of the body survives. He pressed further. And what if that cut requires you to sacrifice something you consider essential, something you thought was a fundamental part of who you are? Cassia finally lifted her head. Her eyes were like polished stone, reflecting the dim light from the study lamp. Then it was not truly essential, she replied, her voice completely flat. Survival is the only thing that is truly fundamental. A faint smile touched Orion's lips. She was not just discussing his business. She was reciting the creed of a battle-hardened operative. Good. Because for some time now we have been having leaks. He searched her face for the smallest cracks, the tiny fractures in her composure. It was like watching a drill press slowly bore into solid granite, methodically aiming for a volatile core deep inside. He watched intently for a flicker of guilt, a subtle tightening around her mouth that would expose her hidden knowledge. There was nothing. Her gaze met his, completely unwavering. "They will not succeed," Cassia said, her voice simple and certain. "The rock is much stronger than they imagine." He had guided her to the absolute edge of a direct accusation, and she had countered him with pure, cold confidence. Without uttering another word, she was making it clear that she understood his dangerous world far better than his own loyal men. The paranoia began twisting into something else entirely, a form of calculated dependence. He knew he could not trust her, but he also knew he could not afford to lose her. Her sheer competence was the only barrier standing between his young daughter and the escalating chaos just outside their walls. That desperate necessity started to dissolve the professional lines between them. One evening, he returned from a brutal but necessary meeting, an interrogation that had left him with a bruised hand and a fresh cut on his forearm. He discovered Cassia waiting for him in the hallway. She did not ask him what had occurred. She simply looked down at the blood that was starting to dry on his sleeve. "You should clean that before it stains," she said, her voice perfectly neutral. He followed her without a word into the vast marble bathroom. From a concealed drawer he never knew existed, she pulled out a sterile medical kit and immediately began to work on his injury. Her touch was entirely clinical and remarkably efficient. She carefully cleaned the wound, applied a suture strip to close the skin, and then wrapped his forearm with a tight bandage. The close proximity was startling to him. Absolutely no one touched Orion unless he explicitly permitted it, and never with such casual, unassuming intimacy. "You handle the sight of blood well," Orion observed, his eyes fixed on her precise and steady movements. "It is mostly just iron and water," Cassia replied, smoothly taping the bandage into place. "It all washes off." Just as she was about to pull away, he caught her wrist. His grip was firm, a deliberate reminder of his inherent power. "Who was it that trained you, Cassia?" She did not resist the pressure he applied. She looked directly into his face, not down at the hand that was restraining her. "Life did, Mr. Orion. Life is often a messy business. You either learn how to handle the mess, or you will surely drown in it." He slowly released her wrist. He was certain that her answer was a complete lie, but it was an absolutely perfect lie. It was unassailable, almost philosophical, and it was utterly devoid of any vulnerability. He was walking directly into a trap that he himself had constructed. He was becoming addicted to her controlled strength, to the undeniable fact that she could look upon his empire, his capacity for violence, and his deepest fears, and remain completely unfazed. She never tried to flatter him. She would simply process the current threat level and adapt accordingly. His internal conflict had become a grinding, relentless war. The paranoid and ruthless boss inside him demanded her immediate execution. The weary, tactical man desperately needed her precision and calm. He decided to intensify the surveillance, placing additional microscopic sensors in the walls of her room, desperate to finally catch a single undeniable mistake. He needed definitive proof that she was an enemy, something that would allow him to justify the immense relief of cutting her out of his life for good. The evidence he craved finally arrived in a small, encrypted burst of data that was intercepted by Marcus's team. It was not a phone call. It was a microtransmission, a tiny packet burst sent from a modified electronic toothbrush charger that had been plugged into a wall outlet in Cassia's private bathroom. The content was completely incomprehensible to their initial decoding software. The message used a complex polyalphabetic substitution cipher, which was then layered with extremely heavy quantum encryption. Marcus looked genuinely terrified when he handed the tablet over to Orion. "Sir," he said, "we had to call in our National Security Agency contacts just to verify the type of encryption being used. This is not from a rival gang. This is proprietary, high-level technology used by a state apparatus." Orion quickly skimmed the decoded text. It was dry, cold, technical language, not a love letter and certainly not a threat. It was a formal status update. Target stability high. Proximity has been achieved. Vulnerability assessment is 40% complete. Awaiting the signal for extraction. Location coordinates are now locked. Redacted latitude and longitude. The coordinates pointed directly to a remote, abandoned freighter dock located on the desolate outskirts of the city. It was the perfect rendezvous point for a clean and silent exit. Cassia was not just a threat. She was the fuse that had already been lit. She had successfully gained proximity. She had nearly completed her vulnerability assessment. The initial attraction, the dangerous admiration Orion had felt for her, instantly curdled into a toxic and lethal distrust. He felt the cold pressure of a knife blade against his own throat all over again. Only this time, he knew exactly who was holding the handle. She had not just infiltrated his world. She was actively dismantling it from the inside out, piece by agonizing piece, starting with his daughter's most cherished toy. The Hydra chose that exact moment to finally strike. They were no longer hitting his supply chain. This time, they hit the compound, and they hit it hard. The entire south wall erupted in a massive explosion that rocked the very foundation of the building. This was not a subtle infiltration attempt. It was a full-blown siege. And Orion knew with a sickening certainty that this precise vulnerability, the specific structural weakness in the south wall, was classified information only Cassia could have possibly provided. The game was officially over. The confrontation was going to happen right now. Orion grabbed the tablet displaying the coordinates, quickly strapped on his ballistic vest, and charged toward Ara's room. He was not going to protect Cassia. He was going to kill her. The air grew thick and choked with concrete dust. The sound of sirens was now useless noise, completely drowned out by the thudding rhythm of sustained automatic gunfire. Orion moved fast, keeping his body low, navigating the corridors that once felt completely untouchable. The south corridor was simply gone. There was just a crater where a solid wall used to be. He heard shouting, the wet, sickening sound of close-quarters combat, and the metallic scent of aerosolized blood already mixing with the thick smoke. Ara's suite was located 3 floors up, secure, but perhaps not secure enough if Cassia had planted other surprises. Orion firmly gripped his P320 pistol. He was not thinking about loyalty or betrayal anymore. He was thinking only about trajectory and immediate damage control. The betrayal felt like a secondary wound. The primary objective was now survival and the forced liquidation of the traitor in his home. He reached the main stairwell, taking the cold metal steps 3 at a time. The power began to flicker. Emergency lights bled a sickly green glow onto the marble walls, turning the entire scene into something from a claustrophobic horror film. The heavy steel door to Ara's private quarters was bolted shut from the inside. Orion quickly punched in the override code. The door hissed open. Inside, Cassia was kneeling by the bed. Ara, only 4 years old, was silent, clinging tightly to a worn, stuffed bear, her eyes wide open but completely dry. Cassia was not panicking. She was calm, clinical. She had the small child draped in a specialized Kevlar blanket. It was standard issue for operations in high-risk zones, something that no normal nanny would ever have in her possession. She looked up at Orion, her face now smeared with soot, entirely unfazed by the weapon pointed squarely at her chest. "Took you long enough," Cassia said. Her voice was flat and dry. There was no fear, and there was no apology. Orion did not lower the gun. "The coordinates, Cassia," he demanded. "The dock, the extraction signal." He crossed the room in 2 massive strides. He slammed the flat of the gun hard against her temple, pulling her up and pressing her against the wall. The Kevlar blanket slipped slightly from the child's shoulder. Ara whimpered, a tiny sound that was lost in the growing sounds of war just outside. "Who sent you here?" Orion's voice was a low grind, raw and incredibly dangerous. "It does not matter now, does it?" Cassia did not even flinch. Her breathing was completely steady, almost meditative. The south wall. You gave them the schematics. I gave them the weakness, she corrected him, her tone sharp and brutal. That was the official mandate. Infiltrate, assess, and then exploit. And what about the status report, the one that said, target stability high? Was that about me, Cassia? Was I the target? A massive blast suddenly shook the entire wing of the building. A large piece of the ceiling plaster broke loose and fell, grazing Orion's shoulder. The building groaned under the assault. Initially, yes, she finally admitted. Her eyes were sharp, focusing on something just behind him, not on his face. A clean cut. Dismantle the Lyra syndicate from the head on down, then get out clean. What changed? He asked, pressing the muzzle of the gun harder against her skin, drawing a thin bead of red blood. You, she whispered, not with any drama, but just stating a simple fact. And her. She glanced quickly over at Ara. Your world is an ugly one, Orion, but it is real. My old world was just a projection, a complete lie. I saw how you genuinely protect her. I saw what you hide underneath all of that control. The door alarm suddenly screamed. A rapid series of focused explosions tore through the exterior hallway access point. The Hydra was not using rifles to try and breach the door. They were using specialized breaching charges, specific and precisely targeted. They are coming through the ventilation shafts. Level 2. Cassia suddenly snapped, completely ignoring the gun pressed to her head, and pointed to the eastern emergency hatch. It is a standard three-pronged high-value extraction pattern. They are not here to kill you. They are here to take you. For a moment, Orion hesitated. The incredible level of detail, the immediate and flawless tactical assessment, was perfect. It was the language of a seasoned field commander, not a glorified babysitter. How do you know all of that? Because I trained their trainers, Cassia said, pushing his gun hand away with a sudden, precise movement that disarmed him without any violence. The P-320 spun once in the air before he managed to catch it. She moved far too fast, too efficiently. The undeniable truth of her capabilities was like a cold slap to his face. Get Ara into the panic room, Orion ordered, switching gears instantly. Survival now trumped his desire for revenge. He could always shoot her later. It was too late. A squad of 5 men, heavily armored in black tactical gear, burst through the fractured hallway door. They moved with a silent, synchronized efficiency. These were not the syndicate's usual muscle. These were trained professionals using suppressed weapons, moving together as a single, lethal unit. Orion fired his weapon twice, center mass. The body armor held, but the sheer impact staggered them. Cassia did not waste any bullets. She grabbed a heavy bronze lamp from the bedside table and hurled it directly at the leading man's faceplate, momentarily blinding him. Then she moved, fast and fluid. She was not just fighting, she was neutralizing. A swift sweep of the leg, a pressure point strike to the throat, a borrowed knife from one of the downed men plunged instantly into the armor seams near the shoulder. Orion handled the other 3 with pure fury and muscle. He used the environment itself, slamming one attacker into the reinforced glass of the balcony door and emptying his entire magazine into another's head when the man's helmet finally cracked under repeated blunt force trauma. Their teamwork was a frightening spectacle, an unrehearsed symphony of violence. Orion observed the pure economy of her actions, the way she never wasted a single motion. Her gaze identified dangers that had not even entered his perception. She was an engine built for killing. A single soldier, the last survivor of the entry squad, succeeded in getting around Orion's flank. He brought up a silenced firearm, pointing it directly at his blind spot. Cassia registered the threat. She stood much closer to the only viable exit, an emergency ventilation hatch she had already pinpointed. It was an open road to the outside, her designated pickup location, her return to a different life. She chose not to take it. Instead, Cassia propelled herself forward, slamming into Orion and forcing him away from the lethal trajectory. The silent volley of bullets chewed into the wall where his skull had been just seconds earlier, raining down plaster dust and hot metal on them both. She twisted on the floor, snatching his dropped P-320, and fired two precise shots into the attacker's unprotected neck, just where his helmet met the body armor. An abrupt silence descended upon the room, broken only by the ragged, desperate gasps of the two survivors. Cassia remained on the ground, her breathing heavy, but the firearm held perfectly still in her grip. Her mission, her flawless escape plan, the entire orderly structure of her existence, was now in ruins. She had just given up everything to rescue the very man she had been dispatched to eliminate. She had actively selected this world of blood and mayhem. Orion gazed down at her, his expression not one of desire or admiration, but of a chilling, profound comprehension. She had not merely endured his world. She had made a conscious decision to inhabit it, incinerating every bridge behind her. He extended a hand to her. It was covered in his own blood and the crimson of the men they had just dispatched. She accepted it without hesitation. The atmosphere was thick with the smells of gunpowder, sweat, and their shared brutality. Alarms continued to blare throughout the compound. "They will just send more people," Orion said, his hands moving with the smooth, practiced motions of a machine as he reloaded his magazine. "I am aware," Cassia answered, checking the ammunition count on the weapon she had taken. Her eyes were already sweeping the area, searching for the next defensible position. "Where are the building plans for the lower levels?" The last remnants of mistrust between them had crumbled, replaced by a cold and urgent need. She was now in a position to take everything, and she was starting by demanding the keys to his entire kingdom. Orion did not waste a single moment with questions. Trust was no longer a factor. The only thing that mattered was capability. He reached for a hidden steel panel behind his desk, ripping away the decorative front. The panel slid open with the sharp hiss of hydraulics, unveiling a tactical tablet inside. He threw it toward her. "Sublevels 2 through 5. They are advancing through the service corridors. They broke through the secondary firewall 5 minutes ago." Cassia snagged the tablet with one hand. Her eyes devoured the intricate blueprints displayed on the screen. The diagrams were complex, showing ventilation shafts, power line routes, and the most critical defensive choke points. Her finger immediately tapped a location on the display, a secondary steam pipe junction located near the central server room. "The weak point is right here," she declared, her tone completely flat and empty of any fear. "It is not structurally sound. If they use thermal charges on that spot, they can bring down the primary support pillar. Our job is to stop them before they reach it." Orion gave a single sharp nod. There was no room for discussion. He took hold of a heavy assault rifle, the cool metal a comforting weight in his hands. They moved with purpose, not a frantic run, but the kind of swift, low-profile advance used by people who deeply understood the physics of a firefight. The hallway beyond the office was a scene of carnage. Twisted steel, shattered panels, and the heavy, metallic smell of recent bloodshed stained the walls. Orion advanced like a force of nature, using overwhelming suppressive fire and sheer forward momentum. He cleared every corner with brutal finality, his method built on pure destruction. He was a creature of raw kinetic force. Cassia's style was entirely different. She was like water moving around a rock, her steps completely silent, her actions surgically precise. For every 3 rounds Orion fired, she used a single bullet aimed at the central nervous system or the femoral artery. Her shots were calculated to guarantee an immediate stop. Her every movement was efficient. They arrived at the stairwell that led downward. 2 Hydra guards were coming up, their attention fixed on securing the floors above them. Orion started to lift his rifle. Cassia caught his arm, pulling him back into the shadows of a recessed doorway. "Noise attracts more of them," she breathed, her lips close to his ear. "Let them go by." We moved down. We cut the head from the serpent. He paused for a fraction of a second, a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of a fight, but her reasoning was impossible to deny. He lowered his rifle. He could feel the warmth radiating from her body, a signal of her tense, coiled readiness. The heavy boots of the two soldiers stomped past their hiding spot, completely unaware of their presence. The moment the sound diminished, Cassia was already descending the stairs, taking 3 at a time while staying deep within the shadows. The sublevels were confined, claustrophobic tunnels of concrete made for maintenance crews, not for combat. The air down here was colder, thick with the scent of ozone and machine lubricant. The quiet itself felt menacing, a void just waiting for gunfire to tear it apart. "This is Hydra's specialty," Orion murmured as they rounded a sharp corner. "Tunnel fighting. They train for sieges." "I am familiar with their methods," Cassia responded, her gaze locked on the thermal signatures she was tracking on the tablet. "They depend on saturation tactics and overwhelming numbers. They will not anticipate a surgical strike." They located the last line of defense that was protecting the main server chamber. 4 heavily armored operatives were dug in, using overturned server racks as makeshift cover. They were coordinating over their communication devices, their voices muffled but urgent as they discussed thermal charges and structural weaknesses. Orion readied himself to attack. His every instinct screamed at him to rush the threat directly. Cassia stopped him once more, her hand gripping his tactical vest. This time, her hold was stronger, a silent order that superseded his own judgment. She gestured toward the ventilation shaft located directly above the enemy barricade. It was far too small for Orion's frame, designed only for wiring and small maintenance drones, but it was perfectly sized for her. "A distraction," she said clearly, her eyes fixed on the hostile positions. "You make a lot of noise and draw their fire. I will go over the top, then disable their communications and their lights. After that, we end this." Orion looked at her face, faintly illuminated by the emergency lighting. She was not asking for his permission or proposing a strategy. She was deploying him as a resource. It was a stark and sudden reversal of their power dynamic. He felt a sharp, dangerous excitement. It was the realization that he was no longer fighting this battle by himself. He was now fighting alongside something just as lethal and just as calculating. "Fine," he grunted, accepting his temporary role as the subordinate in this tight space. Then he unleashed absolute hell. A long, sustained burst of automatic fire slammed into the server racks, sending a shower of sparks and metal fragments everywhere. The Hydra operatives fired back without a moment's hesitation, forcing Orion to take cover behind a support column, their complete attention now locked on his position. Just as she had predicted, their overwhelming fire was aimed entirely at the source of the noise. Cassia had already vanished. She had scaled the wall without a sound, locating the recessed handle of the ventilation duct. She slipped inside with the unnerving grace of a person specifically designed for infiltration, her body effortlessly folding into the cramped passage. Within the total darkness of the duct, she moved like liquid mercury, silent and impossibly fast. When she finally dropped from the ceiling behind the entrenched soldiers, she did not bother with a gun. She used a specialized, retractable wire, a tool Orion recognized immediately from highly classified intelligence briefings. It was a silent and incredibly effective instrument of death. The process was swift, quiet, and brutal. The first 2 soldiers collapsed over their weapons before their partners even noticed that the communications had gone silent and the tactical lights had winked out. In that brief moment, Cassia had the 3rd agent's throat exposed and broken. The 4th soldier spun around, shooting blindly into the darkness, his actions driven by panic at the sudden, soundless elimination of his entire squad. Orion used the opportunity, rolling out from his cover and sending a controlled, lethal volley of rounds into the operative's exposed chest. And then it was over. The silence that came next was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Orion walked cautiously into the chamber, carefully stepping over the bodies. He found Cassia standing above the last man, her breathing just slightly uneven. She was not marked with blood, only with the grime from her journey through the ducts. She was composed, completely professional. She looked up at him, the expression in her eyes impossible to decipher. It held no victory and no regret, only a sense of completion. The compound fell quiet. The far-off alarms faded to an exhausted whine before being cut off completely. The Hydra assault had been shattered. The head of the snake had been removed. Orion stood amid the ruins of his personal empire. The destruction was significant. Security networks were destroyed, and his personnel casualties were high, but he was still alive. His daughter, who was secured deep inside the emergency bunker, was safe. He turned his attention to Cassia. The light filtering through a broken window illuminated the fine layer of dust that was settling in her hair. She had systematically taken apart a professional paramilitary force in just 10 minutes, had saved his life on 2 separate occasions, and had successfully bypassed all of his paranoid security measures. He had no need to ask her why she had chosen to stay. He could see the evidence in the way she held her weapon, in the way her eyes scanned the exits even now, and in the way she had abandoned her perfect escape route, the path that led back to her old life. She had willingly chosen to carry the weight of his world. He began to walk toward her, his heavy boots crunching on the shattered ceramic floor tiles. He stopped about a foot away from her, close enough to be a potential danger, yet far enough to preserve the lethal space that now existed between them. "The mission," Orion said, his voice a low, gravelly sound. "Tell me what your orders were. I want the truth now. No more hidden meanings." Cassia held his gaze without flinching. "My orders were to gain access. I was to identify all vulnerabilities. Then I was to wait for the exploitation signal." "The exploitation signal?" he echoed, the words tasting like acid in his mouth. "Did you ever send it?" "I sent the initial confirmation signal," she confessed. "But the meeting point I established was a complete fabrication, a dead end for my controllers. Based on the chaos here, they would have been expecting my extraction tonight. Instead, all they received was silence. And the dead operatives you left for them just outside the perimeter?" She paused, before adding in a flat, emotionless tone, "I have severed that connection permanently." Orion processed her words. She had not simply had a change of heart. She had incinerated her entire former life just to protect his. He needed an explanation, not a poem. She had just declared war on her former agency, an act that was a guaranteed death sentence, and he required the cold, operational reason. In his world of calculated violence, every action had a price, and he had to understand the logic behind her gamble. Cassia slid the borrowed pistol into its holster with a shrug. "Your daughter required legitimate protection, not the illusion of it. The security staff you employed was dangerously inept, and your entire organization, Orion, is far too entrenched to be toppled by common mercenaries or political spies. I decided if it was going to burn, it would be on our terms, under our control." It was a masterful justification, shifting her motive from sentiment to strategic necessity. She had assessed his chaotic power, understood its potential, and chose to become its new foundation, ensuring she held the keys to the entire structure. Orion released a long, measured breath, the gears in his mind turning. His standard protocol for betrayal was execution. It offered a clean, irreversible solution. Yet, as he looked at Cassia, he understood that eliminating her would be like shattering the most perfect weapon he had ever encountered, destroying the only true shield he had ever possessed. "You know everything now," he said, his gesture taking in the smoldering ruins that surrounded them. "Every vulnerability, every hidden protocol, every blind spot in my defenses. You represent the single greatest existential threat to the Lyra Syndicate." "I am," she confirmed without hesitation, "and I made the choice to become its greatest defender instead." He moved toward her, erasing the small distance between them until the air grew thick and heavy with the smell of gunpowder and the weight of unspoken consequences. "In that case, you are no longer an employee," Orion declared, his gaze as cold and hard as forged steel. "You are not a prisoner, and you are certainly not a nanny anymore." He reached down, not to touch her, but to retrieve the tactical tablet she had dropped on the floor. He placed it back in her hands. The complex schematics of the compound still glowed on the screen, lit by the erratic flicker of emergency lighting. The Hydra will attack again. We must reinforce the lower-level defenses before sunrise. You will tell me where we begin. Cassia glanced at the digital blueprint, then met his eyes. The transformation was absolute. She had endured the violence, the paranoia, and the constant threat, proving she could not only survive it but master it. She tapped a section of the screen, highlighting the structural weaknesses near the primary generator. We start with the firewalls, both physical and digital, she stated with authority. And your security chief is the traitor. He guided them straight to us. I need his full access codes and an entire response team that answers only to me for the restructuring. We start this minute. A slow, predatory smile curved Orion's lips. It was a smile that held no trace of warmth, only the deep satisfaction of a predator recognizing an equal. He had finally found his counterpart, not a lover or a subordinate, but an essential, stabilizing force forged from steel and ice. Consider it done, partner. He pivoted and walked toward the command center, leaving her alone amidst the wreckage and chaos. Cassia watched him depart, the heavy tablet a symbol of her new authority. She stood in the ruins of his war, now holding the blueprints for his future. The blood she had shed had purchased her a seat at the king's table. She never once looked back at the escape hatch she had ignored. She was finally home. As Orion walked away toward the command center, he left her standing in the heart of the devastation. Cassia watched him go, the weight of the tactical tablet a solid presence in her hands. She was standing in the wreckage of his violent world, holding the detailed plans for its reconstruction. The price of admission had been paid in blood, and it had earned her a place beside the throne. A moment later, the Lyra cleanup crew arrived, moving with a silent, ghostly efficiency. They flowed like shadows across the basement floor, their actions precise and almost reverent in the face of the carnage that had just occurred. They spoke no words, using only practiced hand signals and low, coded hums to coordinate as they began to erase every trace of the attack. The air was thick and acrid with the metallic scent of ozone and expended ammunition. Cassia paid no mind to the bodies, stepping over them to get to the main server installation. Her former life had taught her a fundamental lesson. Destruction was always the necessary first step before reconstruction could begin. She had once been a professional dismantler. Now, her mission was to build something even stronger from the ruins. The first order of business was the security chief, Marcus. Orion had not needed to issue a direct command. The understanding between them had been forged in the chaos of the firefight. Loyalty in their world was absolute, and Marcus had failed that test. He was already secured in a deep-level interrogation room, bound tightly to a heavy steel chair. Orion led Cassia down a sterile white corridor, the air growing colder and colder with each step they took. He is aware of all the redundancies, Orion stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. The locations of the dead drops, the names of the shell companies, every single mechanism that keeps this operation running. Cassia gave a single sharp nod, her expression purely clinical. I require his access codes, and I need a complete map of his infiltration. I need to know precisely how deep the Hydra's roots have grown into your organization. They stepped inside the room. Marcus looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of pleading and panic. When he saw Cassia, the woman he knew only as the nanny, he let out a choked sound that was half scoff, half terror. She's a child, Marcus spat at Orion. You brought the help down here to watch this unfold? Cassia walked calmly toward him, completely ignoring the insult. She did not raise her voice, nor did she make any threats. She simply reached out one hand and pressed a very specific point, just behind his collarbone. Marcus let out a strangled gasp, his face instantly covered in a sheen of cold sweat. It was not a violent blow, but a targeted application of pressure, one that immediately crippled his lungs' ability to draw a complete breath. The Hydra's primary contact, Cassia instructed, her voice low and perfectly even. His name, his current location. Give them to me now. Marcus bucked against his restraints, his body convulsing as he struggled for air. He tried to form words, but all he could manage was a wet, ragged cough. Orion leaned casually against the reinforced doorframe with his arms crossed, watching the methodical display of controlled cruelty. The man's pain did not bother him. He was evaluating her technique. She worked with an unnerving speed that was far from amateurish. She was dismantling Marcus's psychological defenses layer by layer, not with brute force, but with the chilling efficiency of a surgeon. The codes for the offshore account, Cassia pressed, shifting her stance just slightly to apply more focused pressure. You have 60 seconds, Marcus, or I promise that the next week of your existence will be spent wishing you could return to this moment. That was all it took. Marcus broke completely. He rattled off a long sequence of numbers and names, his confession a desperate, broken stream of information. Cassia listened intently, committing every single detail to her flawless memory. She took no notes. She simply absorbed the data. When he was finally finished, panting and utterly defeated, she stepped away from him. She looked over at Orion. The question was silent but perfectly clear. Should she dispose of him, or should he be imprisoned? Orion pushed himself off the wall. He did not even glance at Marcus. His eyes were locked on Cassia. You are in charge of security now, he said, his words granting her complete and total authority. You are responsible for your own department's messes. She did not miss a beat. She did not need a firearm or a knife. She simply picked up a thin, discarded fiber optic cable from a maintenance kit on a nearby table. The termination was swift, silent, and impeccably clean. Orion waited until the heavy interrogation room door sealed shut behind them before he spoke again. You did not even flinch. Flinching is inefficient, Cassia replied, her focus already on the tablet as she scrolled through the stolen access codes. It wastes valuable time and resources. The next logical step is to replace the entire internal communications network. Marcus left multiple backdoors in the system. She gave him absolutely no time for moral reflection or emotional analysis. Her approach was pure, cold logic. Orion felt a flicker of something that was almost admiration, a feeling he quickly suppressed with the hard reality of their new arrangement. She was a weapon, and now that weapon was pointed inward, guarding his very core. The next 2 weeks became a frantic blur of construction, intense vetting of personnel, and systematic purges of anyone deemed a risk. The Lyra compound was transformed from a stronghold into a fortress within a fortress. Cassia moved through its newly reinforced halls wearing tactical pants and a plain black t-shirt, the unofficial uniform of command, not of service. She almost never slept. On the rare occasions she did, it was on a cot set up near the communications center. Orion watched her constantly. He observed how the other syndicate members, hardened men who built careers on intimidation and violence, followed her directives without the slightest question. She never yelled or made overt threats. She simply laid out the threat assessment, her proposed solution, and the exact consequences of failure with a chilling and undeniable clarity. They gave her their respect because she never shied away from the necessity of blood. The most unsettling thing was the effortless transition between her different roles. One afternoon, Orion discovered her in the brightly colored playroom, sitting on the floor surrounded by plush animals and wooden building blocks. Anna, his 4-year-old daughter, was perched quietly in her lap while Cassia carefully braided small, colorful ribbons into her hair. The entire scene was one of domestic tranquility, a dangerously peaceful illusion. The perimeter alarms on the West Wing are still registering as overly sensitive, Orion said, his presence in the doorway immediately sucking all the warmth from the room. Cassia finished tying the last braid with a smooth, practiced knot before looking up. They are currently calibrated to detect thermal variances smaller than a rat, she explained calmly. The Hydra utilized drones during their last attempt. We cannot afford to rely on simple line-of-sight defenses again. She then gave Anna a gentle smile. Are you ready for story time, sweetie? The little girl nodded, completely oblivious to the fact that her nanny was simultaneously discussing the intricate details of military-grade security protocols. Cassia stood up and looked directly at Orion. The switch was immediate and total. The nurturing warmth in her eyes vanished, instantly replaced by the calculating coldness of a master strategist. I also identified the leak in the cash flow, Orion, she continued, her voice dropping to a low, confidential pitch. It is originating from the transport company based in Monaco. They managed to skim 7% during the last fiscal quarter. I have already initiated a freeze of their assets and rerouted the primary funds through the Cyprus holding. The cleanup team is already en route to address the situation. Orion could only stare at her, momentarily stunned into silence. The absolute ease with which she managed both the nurturing, gentle role for his daughter and the brutal, violent necessities of his life was profoundly unsettling. She was not playing a part or wearing a mask. She simply embodied both realities at once. "You are truly terrifying," Orion stated, delivering the words not as an insult, but as a deep assessment of her immense value. "I told you that I could take it all on," she countered simply. "That includes the soft parts as well as the hard parts. You underestimated my overall capacity." He gave a slow, deliberate nod. He had spent his entire adult life building impenetrable walls, trusting absolutely no one, and expecting betrayal around every single corner. He had always feared that letting someone get close would mean exposing a fatal weakness. Cassia, however, had just proven that sometimes, allowing the right person in means you are not creating a vulnerability, but importing an unbreakable defense. That evening, Orion brought her into his office at the top of the tower. A faint scent of expensive cognac and new leather filled the air. Far below, the city lights sparkled, a vast grid of enemies and assets waiting in the darkness. He poured 2 glasses of the amber liquid, and she took one without a moment of hesitation. "The Hydra is wounded, but it is not gone," Orion stated, slowly swirling his drink. "They will attack our new defenses. They know I have a powerful new piece on the board. They understand the game has changed." "Let them come," Cassia replied, taking a slow, deliberate sip. "They will discover the gates are now guarded, and the sentries are watching." Orion set his glass down on the gleaming desk. He then pulled a heavy, leather-bound ledger toward himself. It was the original Lyra Syndicate Registry, a book that held decades of secret transactions, vital contacts, and hidden resources. This book was his entire life. It was his family's legacy and his single greatest weakness. He pushed the heavy volume across the desk so it stopped in front of her. "This is not a job offer, Cassia," he said. His voice was a low growl, a tone he reserved for delivering absolute commands. "You destroyed your own life to protect mine. That action has compromised you forever. You have no path back to your former masters. To them, you are a traitor, a failed asset, or a liability that needs to be eliminated." "I know what I have become," she said, her voice steady. "Good," he continued, "because in this house, you are not an employee. You are not some glorified bodyguard, and you are certainly not a simple nanny." He leaned across the desk, his gaze sharp and intense, demanding her complete focus. "You are the foundation of this entire structure. You are my second in command. Every piece of information that moves through this syndicate now moves through you. You will control the intelligence. You will control the money. You will control who gets in and who does not." He slid the ledger the final few inches until it touched her hands. The book felt impossibly heavy, dense with secrets. It was the weight of a criminal empire. "You have earned this position," Orion finished. "But you must understand me. The loyalty you demonstrated tonight has to be forever. Any secret plan, any moment of doubt, and the punishment will be swift and final. We are partners in this, but this is still my organization. Do you agree to these terms?" Cassia wrapped her fingers around the worn leather cover of the book. The cold truth of their new arrangement washed over her completely. She had given up her personal freedom in exchange for immense power. She had surrendered her anonymity for absolute control. She was now part of a world of constant threat, where her only value was her ability to keep Orion alive. "I accept," she confirmed. Her voice was not victorious, only resolute. She opened the heavy ledger and ran a finger down the first page of names, reading through old alliances and potential points of failure. She pulled her tactical tablet closer, cross-referencing names from the book with current financial statements. The first thing we must handle is the outstanding debt to the Vulov family, Cassia said, already deep in her analysis. The amount is too large. We need to sell the South American properties to generate cash and cut that connection permanently. It is a vulnerability we cannot allow. Orion simply watched her work. She was already inside the machine, lost in the complex details, ignoring the man who built it. She was examining his life's work with the detached, critical eye of both an auditor and a military general. He smiled, a dark, subtle expression of true victory. He had been searching for someone to comfort him in his paranoia. Instead, he had found someone powerful enough to hold the sword for him. Cassia sat across from him, sipping her drink, with the syndicate's entire history laid bare on the mahogany between them. She was now the architect of his security, the instrument of his vengeance, and the guardian of his child. She had not just entered his dangerous world, she had seized a fundamental piece of its very structure. She had taken control of it all. The endless night outside was filled with danger and opportunity. And for the first time in many years, Orion did not feel the constant need to check his back. He had built an empire on violence and blood. Now, he would command it with cold logic and calculated moves, with his silent queen sitting right by his side.